A lot of the organizing and activism that emerged in the last year and a half, while extremely powerful and indeed historic, um, so much of it was done in the mode of emergency and urgency. And so I think we found ourselves calling emergency demos, sort of ruffling up contacts to bring to pre-organized demonstrations. On my end, a lot of the emergency was trying to get money to particular individuals and families and organizations in the context of uh, some really terrible atrocities, and the kinds of things that no human should ever have to go through and experience, from freezing cold to drowning in rainwater to lack of food to all of the above, while dealing with soaring unofficial market prices and people taking 30 and up to 50% of recipients' money for bank transfers and things I'm sure you're quite familiar with. But I think emergency mode and the urgency mode are things we need to start to kind of maybe move away from and start to think about what we are doing. And I'm sorry if I'm already kind of like preaching to the choir on this one, but it's just a point that I think cannot be overstated. That what we really need to be doing is thinking months and years ahead and directing our actions in the direction of building power and not responding to crises. Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with responding to crises. I have no regrets about anything I was able to do to send a penny to anyone who that helped feed or shelter or rent a tent or whatever it is, right? That this is not to say that there's anything wrong with that, or that it needs to stop even. It's really more, especially when we have collectives of people such as yourself who are within a framework where you're able to think strategically together collectively and able to build a plan and set goals and work towards them and then reassess and evaluate and then that it creates a responsibility on organizations like yours because you have this infrastructure and this ability to strategize, unlike an individual or a family or whatnot. Um, it almost feels like a privilege in emergency mode to be able to think ahead, and so to use that privilege in a way. Um, and it's strange to think of it as a privilege, but I think it may be useful to think of it as a privilege. The privilege of being able to think ahead, the privilege of being able to strategize. Um, so the second point is this point about building power. And I think many of you may come from the labor movement, where I think a lot of this language comes from. I don't know about the labor movement and Labor Party, so maybe I'm making an unfair assumption, but definitely within union conversations, building power is a very big part of what we talk about. And I think that model is really something to learn from, um, in the sense that what distinguishes building power from other kinds of activism, I think, is that it is forward-looking, but also that it's not solely in response to, it's not solely about having a particular political position or analysis that then you're able to kind of push into the street or into the page. Um, it's about thinking about how do we make ourselves more powerful, um, having this analysis, having these demands. How do we better actualize our ability to have them implemented, have them actually, it's one thing to say stop the genocide. It's an entirely other thing to stop UK arms exports to Israel in the middle of a genocide, right? And I think that's a really important difference. I find that much of the activism globally has been about pushing a certain position we call for, we endorse, we have signed on to. Um, but then it's kind of a very different mode to be able to, physically or materially stop something at a dock or at a factory, and perhaps even more importantly, to change something on the level of legislation or policy, or bylaws or practices. whether it's by corporations or by government bodies. And so what enables us to do that is power, and this is a very amorphous and large thing, but this can be numbers on the street, but very often it's also something quite different. It's the ability to kind of figure out the weak spots of a corporation's kind of public image and then really kind of hit home to them that there is going to be a certain kind of reputational harm, if not ideally a harm to this bottom line and to profits, if they do not stop a certain kind of course of action. For instance, producing arms for the Israeli military or enabling the logistics that enable those arms to make it to Israeli ports and airports, and so on. So I think if there is a way to, at the end of every conversation, ask ourselves the question, how does this help us build power? And evaluate it in that light. This can also, and very often does, look like what kinds of alliances are we making? What kinds of coalitions are we entering? Who are we able to bring into this that wasn't already in it? Who was already in it, but perhaps kind of like heading in a direction that wasn't going to materially affect the state of Israel's ability to continue to carry out its 76-year-old genocide. And is now, we're able to move them over to a place where they're actually a very a more effective ally and or participant. And I'm sure I have a lot more to learn from you about what building power looks like from your own experiences. So I'm not going to pretend like I know more about this. But I do find that emergency mode really does hobble us when we are thinking about building power, because we're in this sort of response and reaction mode rather than here's this strategy we have in mind and we're modifying it as it goes, and we're building power and then finding ways to use what power we've built in order to make a change and to make a difference. I think in terms of the direction, I saw that there is a question in the group about positionality vis-a-vis Zionism. And so I wanted to speak to that because I think, some of my, I wanted to say Jewish Israeli friends, but really comrades over the years, and I'm thinking about a few instances 10 and more years ago, where they really tried to kind of bring me into a conversation about the good side of Zionism, about a kind of Zionism that is integral to that has been made integral to a notion of kind of Jewish self-determination, Jewish pride, things that are to be fostered and supported. But I think that in the last, if it were not the case before, in the last year and a half, it needs to be abundantly clear that this is as a result of Zionism. The genocide is the logical conclusion of Zionism. If the Zionist project had colonized a piece of land that did not have an indigenous population on it, or had Zionism been redefined as something that was about Jewish self-determination, but sharing the land with its indigenous population and respecting it, this would be a very different conversation. But the factions within the Zionist movement that took over and became hegemonic were the ones that were genocidal with a veneer of the kibbutz, the socialism, and the kind of Ben-Gurionist veneer of labor and progressivism and kind of a semi-socialism, even if just for the settler population, it was always a genocidal project, because even those people I just mentioned, like Ben-Gurion, like the heads of political Zionism, were always abundantly clear on the fact that this was an exclusivist project. This was always going to be a project that really only saw Jewish life as life that matters, vis-a-vis the indigenous population in the space of wherever this Jewish state was to be created. But then on top of that, the remnants of labor Zionism and any kind of socialist Zionism have really been hijacked. I mean, most of those socialist Israelis now live in Berlin and London and New York. They don't live in Palestine anymore. What we are left with are the revisionists. They've completely taken over. So the Jabotinskyites, right? So we're talking about Ben-Gvir, and we're talking about Smotrich, and we're talking about a context where someone like Netanyahu rules for over a decade, and is able to maintain their hold on power in the middle of a genocide, but also all the other policies that preceded that, right? The 2 years of protest movement over the soul of the Israeli project and the Zionist project. I mean, it generally left. Well, I mean, this is a larger conversation about what that did and didn't do, but just to say that Zionism today leaves no room for question that this is a genocidal project. Um, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to stay that way. This isn't, I think there are a myriad of other ways to rethink the long-term presence of Jewish people whose center of life now is Palestine. But in terms of the Zionist project, in terms of that presence being part of creating an exclusive Jewish state on the land of Palestine, or from the river to the sea, or however that space is, sorry, from the river to the river, from the Nile to the Euphrates, is, I think, no longer tenable. Well, I mean, it needs to be not only abandoned, it needs to be smashed. We basically cannot envision any kind of justice in Palestine with the Zionist project intact. And it needs to come under attack from all sides. And I think the Jewish attack on Zionism and the Jewish reclamation of a Jewish radicalism and a Jewish socialism that was always anti-Zionist has a very big part to play in this. And given the history of Jewish Voice for Labor and your individual and collective histories, you are uniquely positioned to say something very powerful in the face of the Zionist hijack of Jewish identity. And so I think a more explicit and clear anti-Zionist position is something that, I mean, it is something you're clearly taking more seriously and are discussing. But whatever I can do to kind of say that, like, an explicit anti-Zionist position and locating a root cause of the genocide, of the occupation, of the colonization in the ideology of Zionist, in the exclusivism of the ideology of Zionism, is really central. I also saw that BDS is open for question, or is kind of a matter of where do we stand on officially adopting BDS. I would also like to kind of add my voice to, and by the way, I don't think BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a maximalist position. I think it's a bare minimum, to be honest, in the sense that, my old mentor, may she rest in power, Ingrid Jaradat Gassner, she really developed what became known as the rights-based approach to kind of addressing the root causes of the conflict. And so she was often engaged in these debates with people about international law, and international law doesn't go far enough, and international law comes from these bourgeois states, and it's the bourgeois state system and whatnot, all of which is correct. But I remember her response to this was always, I don't actually care about your position on international law, just don't be less radical than international law. And I bring this up to say that any reading of international law concerning grave violations of international humanitarian law or human rights law, the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute, etc., without exception, effectively, the legal sanction for the commission of a crime against humanity or a grave violation of human rights is BDS. That's the legal obligation, and it's not just an obligation on states, it's an obligation on all parties, which actually extends to the individual. And so,
sorry to interrupt. Can I actually just start to wind down? You will get another chance, I promise.
No, for sure. I really have only kind of just to finish this point and have one other point
Please
to make.
Please do.
And so just to say that the international legal position is that since we have a recognition that Israel has been committing the crime of apartheid and has now committed the crime of genocide and basically kind of has committed most of the grave violations of international humanitarian law and has committed numerous crimes against humanity, the international legal position is that we are all legally obligated to cut all ties and stop anything that enables this criminal party, the State of Israel, to continue in the commission of these crimes. So BDS is the legal position And so don't be less radical than international law. And the final point is that I think it is no longer that it can no longer be mistakable or mistaken, that we are back in fascism. This isn't the road to fascism. This isn't fascism around the corner. This is some of the most powerful people in the world who are explicitly and avowedly and exuberantly pro-Zionism and pro-State of Israel, are giving Nazi salutes, right? We have a Nazi in the White House. We have fascism kind of rearing its head all over the place, and not just in the form of white supremacy. We see it in Azerbaijan, we see it in India. And so I think we also need to situate this not just as solidarity happening from the British Isles with something that's happening elsewhere, but that this is also very much a struggle that's happening right here in Britain, whether it's the clampdown on protest, the ways that freedom of speech is being restricted and redirected, and manufacturing consent is kind of taking hold in all of the major media outlets, the emboldening and empowering of far-right and fascist groups in the country, and the fully tight alliance between the kind of imperial countries like the United States and the UK and most European countries and Israel. We're not just, the UK is not just complicit in this genocide. It is not just aiding and abetting this genocide. We now know for a fact that it is part of the commission of this genocide. And this was true under the Tories, and it's true under Starmer. And so I think we also need to recognize that this is not just that old notion of solidarity. I'm here, you are there, you are facing something, I must help you. This is something that we are facing here as well. And that these struggles are not just metaphorically and symbolically connected. They're actually very much materially connected. The fact that the Israeli military has arms companies that operate and build their weapons here, that British warplanes are involved in the actual sorties that go and collect intelligence for the Israeli military, and so on and so forth. The training of each other's forces and police forces and so on. They've told us that there is an international fascist solidarity in place, and they effectively speak of it as such. And it's time for us to wake up to the fact that this is not just I am here, you are there solidarity, but this is really the time to recognize these struggles as very deeply and thoroughly connected. I'll stop there. So on things relating to action, PAL action was raised, issue of kind of like being disruptive, perforating the Zionist monopoly on kind of information and mass media and so on. I think the example of PAL action is one that really I think might be worth studying as a group, in the sense that they picked one target and they've been dogged and almost single-minded in their focus at it. Yes, they use direct action, which is part of the toolbox of possible kinds of action. But it is something worth considering as a modality of action. Yes, it's a Jewish Voice for Labor and so on, but like really, this is our campaign, and we have kind of a razor-sharp focus. With Palestine Action, it's been Elbit, and if they hit Leonardo or Barclays or something else, it's because of a direct relationship with Elbit. And so it's a kind of strategizing and campaigning and thinking and alliance building and legal support creating and whatnot for the purposes of shutting Elbit down. I believe they've shut down or made inoperable 3 of their sites, and there are 6 or 7 to go. And they very much talk about it that way. The 3 down, 7 to go kind of thing. And now on to the next one, and now on to the next one. And so it doesn't have to be Elbit. It can be an arms embargo. It can be a particular company. It can be whatnot. But that kind of singular focus really brings everything. It kind of brings the conversation somewhere where it's really just about a kind of like, how can we be materially effective? And then public relations and communications and mobilization and talking to people and whatnot kind of builds around that. So it's a model. I'm not saying you adopt it. It's just interesting to kind of have something like that to almost compare what you might be doing to. and to think, what is this focus? What is it that we are really kind of strategizing about? Because the liberation of Palestine and fighting fascism and ending imperialism and capitalism may be a bit too much to handle um, in one fell swoop. Um, the question of Zionism and Jewish nationalism is one that came up a great deal. By the way, I don't think that being anti-Zionist, that, there's a question about whether to be anti-Zionist, and then there's a question about how to be anti-Zionist. And I think those are separate conversations. I think me personally, I am one of those people who just assumed JVL was anti-Zionist. So I was kind of a bit taken aback. It was the same with BDS, by the way. I'm like, oh, this is a conversation still. So I will say that I can confirm that your reputation from the outside is just assumed to be anti-Zionist. However, that's kind of like neither here nor there. I don't think that being anti-Zionist needs to translate into being hateful or being name-calling or alienating people, and if somebody kind of still has a soft spot for the promises of Buberist neo-Canaanite Zionism, there may still be a space for them in your group. There is a way where kind of maybe a notion of reclaiming Zionism can be part of anti-Zionism in terms of actually existing Zionism in the phrase that was used. So I think in terms of principle, however, the question is really a question of where do you stand on Palestinian refugees' right to return, right? Which is a much more kind of concrete question. If the idea is that people should not have been displaced, and if they were, they should come back, and if their lands were taken, they should have those lands back, then where does that leave Zionism? If it's an exclusivist Zionism that says, no, this is an exclusivist and supremacist project, then why would you support that? And if it's a Zionism that can cohabit with the return of refugees and a sharing of the space, then it's not actually existing Zionism. It's something quite different, and maybe we're not against that. In terms of a Jewish collective identity, I think the allusion to the Jewish radical tradition book, also there's a new book coming out by Molly Crabapple that I'm helping edit right now on the history of the Bund. Looking at how the Bund responded to this exact question, I think, is really instructive, because in the area of the Pale, there was a kind of Jewish autonomy and self-determination in a way. Yes, due to Tsarist anti-Semitism and whatnot. But this, up until 1905, this was the largest single contingent in the Russian communist movement, right? So this was national, like it had the trappings of a Jewish collective identity, but without being fascist, without being kind of ethnocentric in that exclusivist way, and while being, I mean, not just internationalist. I mean, we learn internationalism from them. They, in a way, kind of helped write the book on internationalism. Is I think what I'm trying to say. So, seeing how Jewish radicals have addressed this exact set of questions in the past, I think what I'm trying to say is us non-Jews learn from this, and you have this in your history to learn from. So I think if you want to invite Molly to speak to this, or the authors of the Jewish Radical Tradition book, and kind of delve into this more deeply, this could be quite productive. In terms of one state and two state, I think people who said, I'm not in a position, I think what Mike and Glenn were maybe saying about like this is it's even as a Palestinian, I don't talk about one state and two state and like these kind of eventual outcomes. I'm going to share a link with you from a study trip that we did between Palestinian and Jewish anti-Zionist. So this was Badil and Zukhrot. We did a study visit to Cape Town as a way of thinking about how did return work in the Cape Town context, and what can we learn from that. So I'm going to share that in the chat now, and then if somebody wants to pick it up and share it more broadly. Oh, I don't know how to send to the whole group. I'm sending it to Leah to send to everyone else. And also on the question of statehood, before this time's out, I'm also going to send another link, which is a text by Ghassan Kanafani before he was assassinated, specifically on the question of statehood. Because, Palestinians never talked about statehood before 1970. That was never one of our demands. Palestine, and not just Palestine, whether it's Palestine or Jordan or Syria or Lebanon, these always only existed in relation to one another. They never existed in their own right. And I think the idea of the nation state and the way that it was kind of brought into our region by imperialism was one of the most destructive things that happened in that area, where you now have a kind of notion of a Jordanian identity and Lebanese identity and completely non-functional polities and states. Um, so yeah, I don't think that there's any necessity to be advocating for a one-state solution versus kind of a 15-state solution or a socialist federation of the Middle East or Arab Springs. Yes, we are against dictatorships and we are against imperialism and settler colonialism, and we want the self-determination of people, and whatever that means, those people need to determine. Yet, it is very clear that there are refugees whose right to return is being denied. Yes, it is very clear that mass murder is being committed in an intentional and systematic way, and that needs to stop. All of the kind of the list of crimes is very evident. But I think one of the things that I was most asked to speak about was the Palestinian Authority and the two-state solution and this question. So I'll just dedicate the rest of my time, which I think is 3 minutes, to that. I'll take a couple of more. Thank you, Liam. First of all, yes, the two-state solution is basically the euphemism for apartheid in Palestine. Partition, the two-state solution, the notion of Palestinian statehood as it is talked about, these are all really just smokescreen for what was also called the peace process and the Oslo process, which any self-respecting analysis of the last 25 years and how that was kind of carried out was very much the creation of a Palestinian Bantustan, and much like South Africa, a non-contiguous set of open-air prisons that would be passed off as a semi-sovereign state with actually kind of the level of sovereignty that one would associate with a municipal authority, not a nation-state authority or a federal government or a government authority. So sewers and streets and paying teachers level of authority. Definitely not having a military or control over its own borders or really even control over its own fiscal policy and monetary policy. So this is a Bantustan. It's a sham state. It's what the British Lord Lugard developed as a theory of indirect rule in the colonial context of Nigeria, which was very much what was adopted in South Africa and the Bantustans. And it's also what we have in the reservation systems in Turtle Island, North America, and so on and so forth. Which brings us to the Palestinian Authority, which was created as the native authority to implement this. There was an initial, my master's research was really about this, was about the initial attempt to create a native authority in the early 1980s under the name of the Village Leagues. This was a aborted project because there was a forgotten intifada in 1981, which made that project fail. However, when the Oslo agreements became a possibility, it was exactly that same paperwork. So the exact same list of authorities in the exact same order of listing that was put forward in 1981 for the village leagues, which were explicitly designed to split the Palestinian national movement between those who would have preferred to have a driver's license and a bank account and an ability to get an exit visa to side with a local native authority rather than with the liberation movement. And that failed then. And so the lesson for Israel was that if this were to work, the only way to make it work would be to take the existing liberation movement, the PLO, and turn it into the native authority. And they succeeded in doing that in 1993 and 1994 with the Oslo agreements. The Palestinian Authority, by everybody's, I mean, anybody in Palestine knows this and can see it. And what will vary is their comfort about talking about it, because all native authorities and all implant states like Jordan and Egypt have a very tried, tested, and true mode of ensuring hegemony and consent, which is to be the largest employer in the land. So we have 1/3 to 2/3 of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza is reliant on the Palestinian Authority for their income, right? And the vast majority of that money goes to security apparatuses. So it's basically transforming a certain section of the population into a police force that can act as the first line of defense for the Israeli settler colonial regime. And they're like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And if you look at the aid money, how it's changed over time, where it's allocated, if you look at employment statistics, if you look at how the Palestinian economy is structured, you can only come to that conclusion. And so I encourage you to look and read up on this. Happy to kind of share resources and stuff. But the Palestinian Authority is there as a Bantustan administration. And those of you who remember what that meant in the South Africa context should have a very clear sense of exactly what that means in the Palestinian context. The Palestinian Authority is made up, in terms of the beneficiaries of it, it's made up of, we're talking about 0.01% of Palestinians who are billionaires and multi-millionaires. They own all of effectively what are like agencies. So the right to sell Mercedes, the right, the license to sell particular products. And then in terms of our natural resources, what's left of them with the way that Oslo chopped up the Bantustan, we don't have our agricultural land. We don't have, but really, some of the main supporters of the Oslo regime are the owners of the quarries, the owners of the manufactories that supplement Israel's export markets, whether it's in agriculture or manufacture. And then the people who own the big, like the telecom companies, the Masri family, the big banking families, that's the Palestinian Authority. That's who the Palestinian Authority is accountable to, except that its primary accountability is to the Israeli state and to the World Bank and IMF that set it up. So the Palestinian Authority is they are our capos. They are our prison wardens. And if it wasn't clear before, and by the way, it was clear before, the campaign against what is called security coordination, if you know who Basil al-Araj is, if you see kind of the record of Palestinian Authority prisons and who's kept in them, torture and murder in those prisons, more Palestinians were killed under torture in Palestinian Authority prisons between 94 and 96 than were killed in Israeli prisons in the entire First Intifada. Right? So this is a subcontracting by Israel to the Palestinian Authority of its own primary defense needs. And then Israel gets to sit back and play second and third and fourth line of defense. When you talk to activists from Palestine, ask them about their arrests. If a US president or a pope or whatnot is coming to visit, it's the Palestinian Authority cops who come in and round up all the activists. It's currently the Palestinian Authority cops who, they besieged the Jenin camp for 2 months. And they are in participation now with the Israeli military's actions on the 3 camps in the north that have been completely depopulated now. So really, aside from any one state, 2 state, other kinds of analysis, it should be just very, very clear that the Palestinian Authority only has the buy-in of those. And by the way, even though it's an employer, I know people personally who are effectively in the evening when they're not at work, entirely trying to undermine the Palestinian Authority, but in the daytime get their paycheck off the and this includes cops. This includes people who will carry a little gun and stand to defend the Israeli soldiers' checkpoint. So even in terms of like this notion of that wage creating a consent, even that has a lot of cracks in it. Plus, what the Israelis are now doing is they're devastating the Palestinian Authority's own coffers and ability to pay off and buy that consent. So the Israelis are also shooting themselves in the foot right now with this kind of like rabid Ben-Gvirism that is making them forget that a linchpin of this entire edifice of the apartheid regime is that they have the Palestinian Authority in a position where it kind of controls that consent of people. Because it's losing that incredibly quickly, and its positionality vis-a-vis the genocide, where it was effectively one of the parties that enabled and abetted and allowed that to happen by not taking a proper position, not allowing people to protest, continuing to ban the organizations that are considered to be the resistance in Gaza, made it a very clear party to the genocide. Much like Jordan and Egypt, which also came up in one of those questions. Jordan and Egypt, as I hope you are all know, and I think you kind of even talked about them as quislings. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is a quisling regime, and Jordan and Egypt are also quisling regimes, also rely on employing their own populations for consent, also police states, also dictatorships, and also, like the Palestinian Authority, no love for the Palestinians themselves as a social body and as people, right? They are effectively merchants in that. And their primary accountability is to those entities that prop them up and allow them to remain, which is the United States, the World Bank, the IMF, and in different ways, the State of Israel. And so there is no surprise that Hussam Zumlut is going to get up and talk about Palestinian statehood and the Palestinian Authority. That's his employer. That's who he officially represents. On paper, it may say the PLO, but there is nothing left of the PLO that is not the PA. The PLO's budget, by the way, is a line item in the Palestinian Authority budget. Right? Always follow the money. And its only function is diplomatic relations because states don't recognize the PA for diplomatic relations. They recognize the PLO because that's the official kind of world level international politics representative of the Palestinian people. For now, its own leadership is trying to implode it and has gutted it systematically to keep the Palestinian Authority infrastructure as the main infrastructure, political infrastructure and representative infrastructure for Palestinians. So I hope that I have covered as much of the ground as I can. I will just say on the ceasefire call, that was always a little bit short-sighted. But one thing I would suggest thinking about is the issue of arms embargo as a kind of replacement demand and goal. It's very much what activists in places like Canada and the United States have been working on. And I think centering an arms embargo as a demand, it's quite an unassailable position. You know, this is an army that we have seen in live time committing genocide. These same arms are the ones that would be the ones dropped on people. And I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but it looks like round 2 is coming, right? They've closed off all of the entry and exit into Gaza. No food allowed, no aid allowed into Gaza. And in the next few months, Netanyahu has indicated that he wants to call up another 400,000 reservists, which how realistic that is, I don't know enough. You know, you should not be surprised if any day now you wake up to news that large-scale mass slaughter has resumed, but in a context where there's almost no more homes left to bomb. So we're really talking about a majority population in tents and in ruins, in what remains of structures. This war is not over, and it hasn't gotten, I mean, you're all kind of, it sounds like people are aware, but what's happening in the north of the West Bank is no less intensity than what happened in Gaza over the last 16 months. It's just much less reported, and they did a lot of work to make sure none of the journalists, the citizen journalists and regular journalists are around. They basically learned the lesson from Gaza. And so they've rounded up and stopped and scared off most of the people who would be the journalists sending out the kind of videos and things that we saw in the early months and continually through the genocide in Gaza. And so and we're talking about the entirety of the north of the West Bank, but also the closure of the rest of the West Bank. So some of you have been, I think, so you know that Wadi Nar route between Bethlehem and Ramallah down that kind of very steep valley. That takes what, like an hour, even with it wait at the checkpoint, hour and a half at most, if there's a flying checkpoint closer to Ram, and when you get to the wall on the other side, it's averaging 5 to 7 hours now, that one trip, right? Most of the checkpoints are closed in a way that's not an entire sealing off, it's just an extreme slowing down. And so the entirety of the West Bank is now a log-jammed traffic jam, effectively, with every single person's car searched, every single person kind of held, and you know, and so you life becoming more and more unlivable, on top of regular raids, and then in the north of the West Bank, actual bombing and razing of homes, demolition of the 3 refugee camps in Tulkarim and in Jenin. And where you have about 40 to 50,000 refugees from those camps not allowed to go home in the camps because as the camps are being demolished and destroyed. So this is happening right now and has been for the last month and a half to 2 months, with the Palestinian Authority's full participation.